So thanks to our three speakers there by the magic of pre-recording. And if our speakers now would like to rejoin us on the live stream, there's Maarten, here's Chris, and do we have Aditi too? Excellent, great. So we have around 30, 35, 36 minutes for questions. There's a couple of questions gone into the Q&A box already. It's a complex topic, and we're dealing with two quite distinct areas here, carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. So we'll try to strike a balance between the two. If that a lot of that was slightly over your head, don't worry. There's actually some resources on C2G's website which introduce sort of a more rudimentary understanding of some of these techniques and some of the challenges that they raise in relation to governance. So once again, you can visit and explore 3wc2g2.net. And hopefully that answers some of your questions. But in the meantime, we have a fabulous resource at our disposal here for the next 20 odd minutes. So let's make use of them, these three experts. I think if you have questions, please remember to put them in the Q&A box. So you can click on Q&A at the bottom, then add them in the box there. And I'll try and put them in to the speakers in short order. But perhaps we can begin with, we've got a couple of questions waiting already. I think these were addressed actually to Aditi. They popped up during your presentation, Aditi. So let's have a go at those first and see. So this one's from Sean Fitzgerald. He mentioned, Sean says that you say that bioenergy crops can limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C, and is this really the consensus of scientists? So this is more a mitigation question, I suppose, in some ways, so relating to working group 3, but would you like to respond on that at all, Aditi, or indeed any of the other panelists?
My understanding is that this is not the consensus of the scientists. It was one study that we have cited, and we did not put any confidence language around this study, so certainly not a consensus. It's a study that was trying to see that, okay, what happens if bioenergy crops is one of the major mitigation measures. Whether temperatures can be limited within 1.5, and they conclude that that would have huge water and land footprint. So I agree. I don't think this is a consensus, and we all know that it's not either or. It's not one mitigation technology. There are no silver bullets practically. Yeah.
Great. And so this presumes, I think, going on with Sean's question, this presumes that other things will happen too. So what else has to happen if it's not bioenergy crops alone? Do you want to respond on that?
I would have to actually look up the paper and see what were the other scenarios that they had actually looked at, but their main focus was bioenergy crops. So I can come back on that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Let's jump now to a different topic. We've got another question from Bo Frederick, which is again on CDR. Maybe I'll come back to that in a moment. And we'll just switch to a question from Pablo Suarez. So Pablo says, given the terrifyingly slow progress on mitigation and adaptation, is it reasonable to assume that SRM will continue to gain prominence in the coming years? And can you share your insights on the chances of IPCC engaging more intensely on SRM, including the humanitarian dimensions, for example? So, for example, through maybe a special report. Who would like to, Maarten or Chris, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a first go. Well, first of all, I think it's really interesting what's happened with the topic of, well, what once was called geoengineering as an umbrella, but is now clearly separated in solar radiation modification and carbon dioxide removal, where the carbon dioxide removal is still squarely with working group 3, as sort of in the remit of what's feasible, but also what are the trade-offs related to the various mitigation options. SRM is covered in a cross-working group box with actually authors from all 3 working groups, but residing in working group 2 and in working group 3. But it's featured in the summary for policymakers only of working group 2, whereas I think 10 years ago, people would have thought it more as a sort of an extension of the set of mitigation options. I think people are now starting to see it more as a last resort measure to manage the rising risks driven by a changing climate, but are also more acutely aware of everything we don't know about the risks it may in turn drive, the risk of responses that both my and Chris's presentations highlighted here, which is also a novel development in the IPCC. So I think that's an interesting evolution to observe by itself, which I think still needs to be internalized by the wider IPCC community. And it's going to be, well, first of all, up to the framing of the next IPCC cycle. Will we still have these 3 working groups? What special reports might logically go along with that? But to some extent, then also the scoping meeting for however those reports get set up will be very interesting to see where this lands. My personal hunch is that there is a growing number of, well, there's more literature, but also more people more acutely aware that we've got less time left, and therefore some of the more radical options are getting closer to us in a way. On the other hand, there's a broader concern about the associated risks, and that's where I think certainly this question about the risk of responses that was highlighted in the Working Group 2 report is bound to gain prominence, and that will include solar radiation modification, but likely also others, including the biofuels, for instance, that we were discussing before. So how exactly that will play out in terms of attention in the next cycle is to be seen. I have not yet heard confirmations of sort of the special reports that would be considered in the next cycle. Certainly an option. I think the whole issue of these risk of responses is bound to get more attention. And I would actually call on all scientists also to make sure we have the right research, with a particular focus on the most vulnerable places, as Chris was highlighting, because that's maybe also somewhat subsumed under Pablo's question. There's a real question about to which extent we understand these risks, but particularly for the places where it matters most. And that's where I think we've got the biggest literature gaps. Thank you.
Thanks, Maarten. Chris, I don't know if you want to add to that. Perhaps, perhaps you can also say something about what's changed since the past report, the AR5, and what's changed between now and then in terms of our understanding and what's in the literature as well. Or respond to the question as well.
Yeah, I think first just that there will be something on SRM still to be assessed and written in the synthesis report from the IPCC that sums up all of the special reports and working group reports of the last few years, and so that'll come out this September. It is restricted to looking at the underlying working group material though, so it won't say things that have not been said in working group 1, 2, and 3. I think, like Maarten, it's interesting to see, and this is also since AR5, that SRM has found a home in the Working Group 2 summary for policymakers this time around risk reduction and its potential to introduce new risks. And that's, I think, to some extent a bit consistent with how it was framed in the special report on 1.5, but it certainly, to me, indicates a shift and also a lot of government interest towards this topic around the risks from response actions to climate change. But that's also a very politically sensitive area. And so many countries are considering, such as the USA, launching large solar geoengineering research programs, largely computer simulations to better understand risks and benefits from solar radiation modification. And I think those programs will provide quite a lot of the information potentially that could be used in future IPCC assessment reports. And so I think a really important shift that needs to happen in some ways for that research, and that's identified in this AR6 assessment, is we've seen a lot of research on SRM impacts on climate hazards, and that's necessary. We don't know enough about that, but there's just so much less research on the risks to people and ecosystems. And I would argue ultimately that any kind of a design space for SRM should be considering the risks to people and ecosystems primarily, and the hazards are just one part of that picture. It shouldn't be primarily targeted at the hazard. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. If I might come back just with another quick follow-up question. You mentioned in your presentation about the sort of the lack of developing country research, and particularly in a nascent field such as SRM and its impacts. those challenges about securing sort of more understanding about impacts on people and ecosystems in particular, perhaps any suggestions or insights from your work on how that might be strengthened, how those issues might be addressed? Obviously there are capacity constraints in different areas of the world, but any thoughts on that from your research and your assessments?
Thanks, Nick. I think one major thing that can improve that situation is more funding for climate change research going directly to researchers in developing countries. A lot of research at the moment flows indirectly, and projects that fund researchers in developing countries directly and therefore give them more freedom to set their own research agendas in line with local questions about climate risk, adaptation, and mitigation, I think can be very, very powerful. I think something we don't consider perhaps enough on the natural science side of the climate change discussion is the people who are empowered to ask the research questions are those who are also empowered to shape the research answers. And so to fund a more inclusive and diverse group of researchers on an increasingly important topic like SRM is a first big step towards that goal of having a more inclusive perspective on the problem. I think a second major thing that can happen is increasing global north, global south partnerships in research. We're starting to see that become more prominent in the SRM discussion, but I think it's also that those partnerships should be ones that are equitable. So it's both global south researchers visiting well-resourced institutions in the global north, but also the other way around, people visiting global south institutions and really getting a good understanding of their perspectives on the problem and investing in capacity building in those institutions in the global south.
Thanks, Chris. And if I might pivot back to carbon dioxide removal now, going back to an earlier question from Bo Frederick, I think addressed to you, Aditi, but by all means others can answer as well. How much nature-based CDR and technology-based CDR will be needed to reach 1.5 degrees C is a question that's posed, and the impacts that will have on things like GDP, or indeed if we get into an overshoot situation, as was mentioned earlier, what implications might that have for consideration around the combinations or the scale of CDR that might be required? Do you have any insights or thoughts on that?
No, unfortunately, I don't, but I'll defer to my other co-panelists. I think this is something that Working Group 3 has dealt with in more detail than we have. Much of our focus was on looking at synergies and trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation, and CDR being one of those categories of mitigation that we looked at. So we really focused on how these can have maladaptive outcomes in terms of adaptation. So, but yeah, Maarten and Chris, they may have more insight into that. But water chapter was very specific about how all of these affect water and food security.
Thanks, Aditi.
I could come in briefly.
Yeah, go ahead. Please do.
I think when we talk about carbon dioxide removal is essential, and messages that have come out of the Working Group 3 report, and then I'm now speaking from a Working Group 2 report on risks and adaptation perspective, I think it's very good to keep in mind what we mean about essential. So there's using carbon dioxide removal to offset very difficult to abate emissions, and using CDR in that context to reach net zero. And then there's using CDR to offset emissions that could be otherwise reduced from reduction of, for example, coal-fired power stations, and saying, okay, we've got to use nature-based solutions to soak up the emissions from coal-fired power stations. That is not a net negative carbon dioxide removal, right? The Working Group 2 report is very clear on the difference between just carbon capture and actually removing carbon from the atmosphere, storing it, and so you've got a negative emission. And I think when we talk about nature-based solutions in that context, when we talk about things like reforestation, so that's restoring forests on what was naturally forested land where there's been forest deforestation or forest degradation, Working Group 2 says that's a good idea. When it's doing things like afforestation, which is planting trees, often not native species, so in the context of Africa, it might be pine trees or eucalypts that are being planted on grasslands and savannas as part of projects to soak up emissions from fossil fuel sources that could be reduced in other ways, then that is a bad idea. it comes with a lot of risks, like Aditi has mentioned, to water security, to food security, to biodiversity. And as global warming continues to rise, those projects are also highly sensitive to high emissions. Those trees can die from drought, they can release carbon through wildfires, you disturb the soil carbon base and have higher biogenic emissions. So there's a very big solution space for nature-based solutions, but there's also a lot of risk involved in those. And I think, just to emphasize again briefly, it's really important to talk about what do you mean when you say CDR is essential, and that focuses on hard to abate emissions, not just using them as a way to offset other easy to reduce carbon emissions. And the second one is they also have their limits, nature-based solutions. They bring quite a lot of risks if you do them wrong, like afforestation, and you can't rely on them necessarily up to very high levels of global warming. They can become net sources of greenhouse gases instead of net sinks. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Chris, for that additional comment.
Maybe one small addition, if I may.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
One area where I think Working Group 1 already pointed out that it will be essential to have negative emissions is if we do overshoot and we want to get back to 1.5. But I think one thing Chris also underlined just now is that that will come with significant risks. First of all, with the scale of deployment of negative emissions you might then need, but also the risks along the way in terms of those solutions possibly having other side effects, other risks to biodiversity, food security, etc., to water, but equally possibly even the risks in terms of safety of those actually being sustainable mitigation options. So I think there's a lot of warning signs about not counting on that as a get out of jail free card in the case of overshoot scenarios. And I think Working Group 2 is particularly underlining the risks that we'll face on such pathways.
And thanks, Maarten, for that. On that, if I may pivot on that issue of risk, we had a question from Karin Zaunberger, which initially was focused on the bioenergy topic that Aditi raised. So considering the potential heavy impact of large-scale deployment of bioenergy measures on food and water security and on biodiversity, as you'd mentioned, Aditi, and this is a similar case for perhaps for SRM. Can it be considered a solution? So is there, considering that there are risks posed by some of these approaches, is there a point, Aditi, where we might say, no, this isn't a solution at all and we should stop even thinking about it, stop exploring it? Or are there processes, decision support tools, policies for better governance to help make decisions, to help policymakers make decisions about which might be appropriate to pursue or to even deploy? Any thoughts on that around the governance processes that might help us to better manage those risks?
Yeah, in the context of CDR and now given our levels of emissions, I think it's hard to rule out anything as a solution. But having said that, we cannot just prima facie rule out that this cannot be a solution, but neither can we just use global models to say this is a solution either. I just feel that there is a need for much more differentiated, locally specific work that needs to go in, say for in case of bioenergy, like 10-15 years ago when this entire bioenergy rush started, I remember discourse in India that there are these, the Indian census classifies certain land as wasteland. This is a British legacy. The land that they did not get revenue from was classified as wasteland, and that kind of continues. So there is this perception among policymakers that wasteland is literally wasteland, but the reality is that some of the poorest people, landless people, nomadic herders, they actually use those so-called quote unquote wasteland as their main source of livelihood. And what started happening was these large scale jatropha plantations, which is a indigenous oil bearing tree, shrubs, and like basically overnight these wastelands were getting converted into these plantations, private sector coming in. And what was really happening was livelihoods of some of the most marginal people were getting affected. So I think around that time, there was a lot of awareness around what's happening. So similarly, I think these issues are very, very local, and there needs to be a series of studies, modeling, of course, to look at the future impacts, but also I think more detailed social science kind of studies that looks out who are the winners, who are the losers, who basically is kind of benefiting, who is being deprived. So I think those kind of things are needed. So neither can we say with a blanket statement, this is not a solution, or that this is the solution. it's obviously way more nuanced. It has to be way more nuanced.
Thanks, Aditi. I don't know, Chris or Maarten, do you want to come back on that point as well? In terms of, perhaps Chris, in the context of SRM, is there, you mentioned in your slide something about the co-evolution of SRM governance and research, ensuring that, for example, governance stays ahead, one step ahead of research. Is there, can you explain a little bit more about what that might involve, or the importance of that in there?
Sure. So I think first on the carbon dioxide removal, I just completely support what Aditi said from an Africa assessment perspective. There's similar legacies of people using ancient local ecosystems, grasslands and savannas that are viewed from other perspectives as degraded forests, and those are then regarded as available for carbon dioxide removal approaches. I think in a South African context, there's an increasing move towards nature-based approaches rather than nature-based solutions to highlight how they need to be locally led and assessed in a local context, so that they're not just sort of presented as these global solutions. On the SRM side around governance, I think a few things there. First is coming back to the research point. I think if we're having SRM as an inclusive global conversation around governance, there does need to be resourcing for developing countries on research, partly because some of the research concerns that are raised, that conversation. In terms of the governance staying one step ahead, I think what is being said there really is around sort of the concern expressed by those in the research literature that SRM be considered as part of a mitigation and adaptation centered, but particularly mitigation centered climate response strategy. So that in the context of governance staying one step ahead of research, that there's this co-evolution where it's able to, from a governance side, SRM be considered in any research and steps towards potential eventual deployment, that this maintains it as part of a mitigation-centered approach, and that it doesn't become seen as a primary kind of techno fix to a climate change risk.
Thanks, Chris. Maarten, anything to add on either the CDR or SRM points there in relation to governance?
Well, I think it's clear that the governance discussion is needed, and I think there's a balance to be struck in terms of the investment in research and the investment in getting that governance landscape right. And part of that, getting the governance landscape right, is also increasing the literacy of a growing number of people from all the different countries and communities to participate. So in that sense also, there's research for the purpose of generating the knowledge, and there's research for the purpose of generating a community that can have the right discussions to get the governance right. I think that's also an element of the co-evolution that we could emphasize more.
Great, thanks. And on this issue of, if I might turn back to one of the issues that were raised earlier about this, there are risks. Obviously, Working Group 2 report outlines in quite devastating detail in places about the risks we face from overshooting 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees global warming. And then some of these solutions also present risks if they're not deployed in the right way. And we heard some examples there in relation to different contexts for CDR deployment, land classifications and so forth. How will policymakers go about comparing these risks to manage? Do we have any clues there? Because it's extremely complex proposition, I presume.
Yeah, and I think in practice they don't, right? And in fact, as scientists, to be quite honest, there is no easy way to aggregate and just tell people like this is the optimal mix or so. You know, if only we could have provided the silver bullet, the golden mix to the world. It's not like that. It's partly weighing different types of uncertainties. My main concern is that and I think that's where the Working Group 2 report is a really big red flashing light, that we don't underestimate the range of risks involved. And in particular the overshoot scenarios, have often looked quite benign, right? You overshoot for a while and then you go back and then you're back at this safe level, right? So it sort of looks okay. You know, we have this bump for a little, but then we're okay in the end. And the answer is very clear. First of all, you'll have lost things along the way. They'll never come back. You have risks that you're not avoiding if you've been on that bump before you get down to 1.5 again. But secondly, getting back to 1.5 is not trivial. So it's also not a given that you can just overshoot and then easily get back to 1.5. And the bumpy pathways have risks of their own that you may not be able to estimate well at this point. So I think that all comes back to that underlying message from the Working Group 2 report, that we have a brief and rapidly closing window to secure that livable future. The longer we wait, the higher the risks. And the main things we can say now is that there are a whole different range of categories of risks that we all don't understand very well yet, but that are big and severe on a global scale. So it's not something to play around with.
Great, thanks, Maarten. We're almost at time now. I'd like to give perhaps Chris or Aditi option for any final comments you'd like to make.
Sure. I think building on from what Maarten said, one point that is really important, I think, is SRM and to some extent CDR. There are response options that carry with them a lot of risk. There are other response options across the Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 reports, though, that we know they are close to no regret options. For example, rapidly reducing emissions from coal-fired power stations. That has a massive benefit for limiting global warming. It also has huge benefits for reducing premature death from local air pollution. So walkability and cyclability in cities, also something that really, really reduces emissions and improves people's health and local environments. So I think from a policymaker perspective, there is a lot of information out there around which options are less risky and which response options carry more risk. To weigh up all the risks is something that becomes increasingly difficult as we let global warming go higher and higher and higher, and we reach for these solutions where we're thinking right now they have some serious risks in and of themselves. We're still at a stage where there are a lot of options on the table that are close to no regret options that have a lot of co-benefits for people and nature, and I hope that policymakers pay close attention to investing in accelerating action in those ones. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Aditi, last word from you?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Maarten and Chris had to say on this. And also, perhaps it's time that also that policymakers are, we often tend to think of policymakers as more and more central level policymakers, national governments, but I think we need to rethink that more at terms of local level participation. When it comes to adaptation now, the wide discourse is around locally led adaptation, because we understand adaptation at the end of the day is a very local issue. But when it comes to mitigation, I think we are still thinking more around centralized ways of, somebody, a national government doing it. Why not also reframe the discourse around some of these mitigation and CDR in terms of locally led? So I think citing, for example, where afforestation or reforestation can take place is such an important decision that can be actually taken at a more local level rather than being done more centrally. Yes, so I was just thinking that we need to actually think more in terms of locally led adaptation, but also locally led mitigation with sufficient finance and technical backstopping as needed from other higher levels of governance and policymakers. But the actual decisions must be best taken by local people who understand their environments the best.
Very good. And on that point, I'm afraid we have to close. Thanks to all our participants for your questions. I think we got through many of them, but apologies if we didn't get to all of the questions. And a very large thank you to our speakers, Maarten van Aalst and Aditi Mukherji and Christopher Trisos. And join us again next time for our next C2GLearn.